An easygoing evening settled over Pine Creek, and the air was thick with the scent of evergreen forests. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades of amber and lilac, its last rays gilding the roof of an old wooden house at the edge of the woods. In this simple home full of memories lived George Peterson, a retired doctor whose hands had saved countless lives over his 70 years. His eyes, faded with time like an autumn sky, still held a spark of kindness, and his heart held the belief that goodness, once given, always finds its way back. That evening, as was his custom, George went for a walk in the woods. The path, worn by his steps over decades, wound through the pines like an old friend who knew all his secrets. He leaned on a walking stick carved from ash, polished by time and care. In the pocket of his old coat was a handful of walnuts, a treat for the squirrels that were used to meeting him by a mighty oak deep in the forest. The air was fresh, filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant song of a thrush. Every step the old man took was met with a soft crunch of pine needles underfoot. He hadn't gone far when the silence was shattered by a sharp, desperate sound, full of pain. It wasn't the cry of a bird or the rustle of the wind. A thin, trembling howl made the doctor stop. His heart, hardened by years of hospital work, beat faster. Something was calling him, needing him. He turned off the path, pushing aside blackberry bushes, and followed the sound, which came again, weaker but even more piercing. In the thickets among the thorny bushes he saw it. A wolf pup, barely a cub, its fur matted with dirt and blood. The little one's hind leg was caught in a rusty trap, its teeth sunk deep into the flesh. The pup's golden eyes met the old man's, not with threat but with a plea that made something stir in George Peterson's chest. He knelt down, ignoring the pain in his joints, and spoke softly, the same way he used to with frightened children in his clinic. "Quiet, little one, I'll help." The wolf pup tensed but didn't snarl. Perhaps it felt the warmth of these calloused hands, which had once nursed the sick and soothed the suffering. The doctor worked carefully, his fingers still nimble despite his age. The trap was old with stiff springs, but he managed to pry it open, wincing at the pup's piteous whimper. Blood oozed from the wound. The leg hung at an unnatural angle. "You really went through it, didn't you?" the old man murmured. His voice was as soft as a warm blanket. Leaving it there was not an option. The forest doesn't spare the weak, and winter was already breathing cold into the nights. Wrapping the pup in his coat, the doctor held it against his chest, feeling the small warm bundle tremble. The walk home was long, each step cautious so as not to disturb the injured creature. The pup's eyes never left the old man's face, and in that gaze, there was something George couldn't explain but felt with his whole heart. A trust as fragile as the first snow. Back at the house, the kitchen became a makeshift infirmary. On the old wooden table, lit by the glow of a kerosene lamp, the doctor cleaned the wound with the same meticulous care he once used to save lives. The pup lay still, as if it understood that this man posed no threat. The old man splinted the leg with strips of cloth and a thin twig, humming an old lullaby his mother used to sing to him in his distant childhood. "Everything will be all right," he whispered, not knowing which of them needed those words more. Night fell and the house grew quiet, save for the crackling fire in the hearth. George sat by the pup, who was nestled in a blanket by the stove. The little one's breathing was shallow but steady. The old man watched him, thinking of the years he had spent alone since his wife's death. His daughter, who lived in the city, rarely visited, and his grandson, a 9-year-old boy with a smile like a sunbeam, came on weekends. The presence of the pup, so vulnerable, filled the house with a strange warmth that had been missing for a long time. He named him softly, almost without thinking. "Spark," the old man said, looking into the golden eyes that flickered like a flame in the night. He didn't know if Spark would survive the night, but watching his breathing, he felt something long forgotten stir within him. It was hope as fragile as a moth's wings, yet so alive that the old man's heart beat a little stronger. Morning in Pine Creek arrived with a soft light filtering through the old linen curtains. George woke with the first rays, feeling a heaviness in his body but a lightness in his soul. He looked at the blanket by the stove where the pup was sleeping. The small chest rose and fell, and his golden eyes, opening slightly, watched him with wary gratitude. "Well, hello there, Spark," the old man said softly, and the corners of his lips twitched into a smile. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel so empty. The day began with caring for the pup. The doctor warmed some goat's milk, adding a little honey, all he could find in the pantry, to help the little one get stronger. Though weak, the pup lapped the warm liquid eagerly from an old bowl. George watched as the tiny tongue touched the milk, feeling warmth spread through his chest. This wasn't just an animal. It was a life entrusted to him, and he couldn't let it down. He moved Spark to a soft bed closer to the window so the sunlight could warm him. The wound on the leg looked better, but the splint needed to be changed daily. The old man took out bandages he had kept since his hospital days and carefully rebandaged the leg, humming the same lullaby he had sung the night before. The pup sometimes flinched but didn't resist, as if it understood that these hands brought only good. By noon there was a knock at the door. It was his grandson Mike, who had come for the weekend from the city. The boy burst into the house like a whirlwind, with a backpack on his shoulders and eyes full of curiosity. "Grandpa, I brought you pies from Mom," he shouted. But then he froze, noticing the strange bundle by the window. "Is that a wolf?" he gasped, walking closer. "Not exactly a wolf pup," the old man replied, getting up from his knees. "Found him in a trap yesterday. Now I'm taking care of him." Mike squatted down, and his face lit up with excitement. "He's like a puppy but cooler. Can I touch him?" The doctor nodded but cautioned, "Gently, don't scare him. He's still weak." The boy reached out his hand, and the pup, after a sniff, licked his fingers. Mike laughed, and the sound, clear as a stream, filled the house with life. They spent the entire day together, like three friends connected by an invisible thread. Mike chattered nonstop, talking about how they were learning poems in school, and how he dreamed of becoming a forest ranger to protect animals. George listened, occasionally chiming in, but mostly he just watched the boy and the wolf pup. Something in their curious gazes, in their openness to the world, reminded him of his own youth, when he too believed that goodness could do anything. In the evening, the old man decided Spark needed more strength. He made some chicken broth, picking out pieces of meat for the pup. Mike helped, holding the bowl while the little one ate, and even tried to draw him in his sketchbook. "Look, Grandpa, I drew him with eagle wings because he's strong, right?" The old man smiled, looking at the drawing where the pup looked almost like a mythical creature. "He is strong, Mike. And so are you." Night fell on the village, and the house was once again wrapped in silence. Mike slept in a narrow bed in the spare room, and George sat by the stove, checking on the pup's leg. He thought about how strangely life works. Just yesterday he was alone, but today his house held two others, a boy and an animal, each bringing light into his heart. He remembered his wife, her soft voice, and her belief that every good deed is like a seed that will one day grow. Perhaps this pup was that very seed, sleeping at his feet. Another day passed, and Mike left for the city, promising to return in a week. "Take care of Spark, Grandpa. He's ours now," he shouted as he ran for the bus. The old man watched him go, feeling a pang in his chest. He turned to the pup, who was already trying to stand, balancing on his healthy paws. "Good job, little one," the doctor whispered, stroking his head. In that moment, he didn't think about the fact that Spark was a wild animal, and that the forest would eventually call him back. He was just happy that life, so fragile, was still breathing right beside him. George, accustomed to waking at dawn, was already puttering around in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the stove. The scent of firewood and herbal tea filled the air, mingling with the subtle warmth of the life that now shared this home with him. The wolf pup, whom he now called Spark in his mind, lay on his bedding by the window. His golden eyes followed the old man's every move. A week had passed since the doctor brought the pup from the woods. The wound on his leg had begun to heal, and Spark, though he still limped, was taking his first shaky steps around the room. George watched him with quiet pride, the way he would watch a patient on the road to recovery. He fed the pup broth, adding finely chopped meat. And each time the pup greedily lapped from the bowl, warmth spread through the old man's chest. "Eat up, little one, you need your strength," he would say, stroking the warm fur. But deep down the doctor knew. Spark wasn't a pet dog. His eyes, full of a wild spark, constantly turned toward the window, where the pines swayed behind the glass. The forest was calling him, and the old man felt it with a poignant clarity. He didn't speak of it out loud, but at night, sitting by the stove, he wondered how much time they had left. Would he be able to let go of someone who had become so dear? In those moments he remembered his wife, her words about how to love is to give freedom, but letting go was painful even if it hadn't happened yet. That day, George decided to take the pup out onto the porch so he could get some fresh air. He wrapped him in an old blanket and carefully sat him on the step. Spark tensed, sniffing the wind that carried the scents of moss and damp earth. His ears twitched, catching the sounds of the forest, and the old man watched him, feeling a mix of joy and anxiety in his chest. "You're a big boy now, aren't you?" he asked softly, and the pup, as if in reply, licked his hand with his rough tongue. By noon, Mike had arrived in the village. The boy ran into the yard, waving a new drawing of the pup running through the forest, surrounded by stars. "Grandpa, look. I drew Spark as he'll be when he grows up," he exclaimed, rushing to the porch. Seeing the pup, Mike knelt down, his eyes shining. "You're walking. I knew you were strong." He held out his hand, and Spark, after a moment's hesitation, nudged his nose into his palm. The boy laughed, and the sound, as pure as a bell, made the old man smile. They spent the day together, like a small family connected by something more than words. Mike told stories about school and how he dreamed of building a treehouse to watch the stars. George listened, nodding occasionally, but mostly he watched the boy and the wolf pup. Their openness, their belief in miracles, reminded him of his own youth, when the world seemed full of possibilities. "Do you think Spark will stay with us?" Mike suddenly asked, looking at his grandpa. The old man fell silent, gazing at the distant pines. "He's from the forest, Mike. The forest is his home, but while he's with us, we'll take care of him." The boy nodded, but a shadow of sadness crossed his eyes. He hugged the pup, burying his face in his fur, and whispered, "You won't leave, will you?" Spark, as if he understood, licked his cheek, and Mike laughed again. In the evening they returned to the house. George cooked some porridge, adding pieces of chicken for the pup. Mike helped, holding the bowl while Spark ate, and talked about how he would call him his best friend. "When he grows up, we'll walk through the woods together. Right, Grandpa?" The old man nodded, but a shadow grew in his heart. He knew that a wild heart could not be tamed, no matter how much he wanted it to be. That night, when Mike was asleep and the house was quiet, George sat by the stove, gazing at the stars. Spark lay at his feet, his breathing steady, but with a strength that was growing every day. The old man thought about how life brings gifts that can't be held on to. He remembered his wife, her gentle smile, and her words. "Goodness is like a river. It flows on, but it always leaves a trace." Maybe this pup was such a trace, fleeting but bright. In the morning, Mike left, promising to return in a week. "Don't let Spark go without me," he shouted, running for the bus. George watched him go, feeling a pang in his chest. He turned to the pup, who was already trying to hop, balancing on his healthy paws. "Look at you, so quick." The old man smiled, stroking his head. But deep down, he knew their time together was melting away like the morning mist. Days passed and Spark grew stronger. He was already running around the yard, limping but with enthusiasm, chasing falling leaves. George watched him with pride and sadness. He began leaving the door ajar so the pup could go out if he wanted, but every evening Spark would return, curling up by the stove. "You're still mine, aren't you?" the old man whispered, and the pup seemed to reply by looking at him with his golden eyes. But one morning a month later, George woke up and didn't hear the familiar scratching of claws on the floor. He got up, his heart sinking. The bedding by the stove was empty. He searched the house, the yard, even the shed. Spark was gone. The old man went out to the porch, looking at the forest that stretched before him like a silent guard. "You went home, little one," he whispered, feeling a lump in his throat. He didn't cry. Years had taught him to accept loss, but a hollowness, thin as an autumn leaf, settled in his chest. He went back inside, closed the door, and sat by the window. The forest was silent, and the old man knew the pup was gone for good. But deep in his heart, where hope lived, he believed their meeting was no accident. The goodness he had given had to have left a trace, invisible but alive. George, as before, rose with the first rays of the sun, but his mornings were now quieter. The emptiness left by the pup's disappearance settled in the house like an uninvited guest. The bedding by the stove remained untouched, and the old man passing by would sometimes stop, as if hoping to hear the familiar scratching of claws. But the forest was silent, and he learned to accept that silence, just as he accepted everything life brought. The days passed slowly. The doctor still walked in the woods, fed the squirrels, mended the old fence, and brewed herbal tea. He tried to fill his time with tasks, but thoughts of the pup returned like an autumn wind, unnoticed but persistent. "You're where you belong now," he would tell himself, looking at the pines swaying outside the window. But his heart, accustomed to the warmth of that small life, couldn't forget so easily. One of those days Mike returned to the village. The boy ran into the house as always with a smile and a backpack full of city treats. "Grandpa, I brought you Mom's apple pie," he shouted. But then he stopped, noticing the empty space by the stove. His eyes, usually so bright, dulled. "Spark left?" he asked softly, as if afraid of the answer. The old man nodded, placing a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "The forest called him, Mike. He's where he's supposed to be." The boy lowered his head, fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "I thought he'd stay with us as a friend." George sat down beside him, looking at his face. "Sometimes friends leave, but they leave something important behind. Spark taught us to care, didn't he?" Mike nodded, but in his eyes was a sadness the old man knew all too well. To distract the boy, the doctor suggested a walk in the woods. "Let's see if your squirrels are hiding," he said with a smile. Mike perked up, grabbed a handful of nuts, and ran to the door. The path, familiar to both of them, led to the old oak, where leaves rustled underfoot, and the air was filled with the smell of pine. The boy chattered about school and a new teacher who talked about stars. But the old man noticed how he kept looking back, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of a gray tail flicking in the bushes. They sat on a fallen log when Mike suddenly asked, "Grandpa, do you miss Spark?" George looked at his grandson, at his honest eyes, and decided not to lie. "I do. He was special. But I believe that the good we give doesn't just disappear. It's out there somewhere in the world, and one day it will come back." The boy thought for a moment, twirling a leaf in his hands. "Like a star. It shines even when we can't see it." The old man smiled. "Exactly like a star." In the evening, when they returned home, Mike took out his sketchbook and began to draw. The forest came alive on the paper, full of shadows and light, and in the center, a wolf with golden eyes ran among the pines. "This is for Spark," the boy said, showing the drawing. "So he knows we haven't forgotten him." George took the paper, feeling warmth spread through his chest. "He knows, Mike. I'm sure of it." Several more weeks passed. Autumn gave way to cold nights, and the forest grew harsher, as if preparing for winter. The doctor continued his walks, but they were now shorter. His old bones reminded him of their age more often. He thought of the pup, imagining him now strong, running on the forest paths free and powerful. Sometimes he thought he heard a distant howl, but it might have just been the wind. One day, returning from a walk, the old man noticed tracks by the porch. They were small but clear, with paw prints and claw marks. His heart skipped a beat. He knelt down, touching the ground with his fingers. "Spark," he whispered, but the forest replied only with silence. The tracks led to the bushes and disappeared. George stood there looking in that direction, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that the pup might not be as far away as he seemed. That night he couldn't sleep. Sitting by the window, he watched the stars twinkling over Pine Creek. He remembered his wife, her words about how every good deed is like a bridge through time. He didn't know if he would ever see the wolf again, but deep down he felt their story wasn't over. Hope, thin as a spider's thread, warmed his heart, and he fell asleep with the thought that the forest keeps its secrets but sometimes shares them with those who know how to wait. George sat at the table, sifting through old letters written in his wife's hand. Each word penned in her neat script was like a bridge to the past, to a time when their laughter filled these walls. But now the house held a silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the whine of the wind outside the window. 3 months had passed since the pup disappeared. George had learned not to look for him in the woods or to listen for every rustle, but the tracks he had seen by the porch that fall had left a spark in his soul, faint but alive. He didn't mention it to anyone, not even Mike, so as not to give the boy false hope. His grandson visited less often now due to school, city life, and the winter that had frozen the roads. But each visit was a breath of fresh air, bringing the old man back to life. That day, clear and frosty, Mike arrived unexpectedly. The bus huffed to a stop at the edge of the village, and the boy, bundled in a woolen scarf, ran into the yard, waving his mittens. "Grandpa, I'm here for vacation. Mom said I could stay with you for a week," he shouted, dropping his backpack by the door. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his eyes shone like 2 lakes in the sun. George smiled, feeling the house come alive. "Come in, traveler. The mint tea is waiting." They sat at the table, eating pancakes the old man had made that morning. Mike chattered about winter sledding and a school play where he was a snowflake, but then he fell silent, looking at the empty spot by the stove. "Grandpa, do you think Spark is alive?" he asked quietly, fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. The old man looked at his grandson's open face and decided to be honest. "I believe he is, Mike. He's strong just like you said. The forest takes care of its own." The boy nodded, but a look of longing crossed his face. "I want to go to the woods, Grandpa. Can we? Maybe he's not far." George hesitated. The winter was harsh and the woods were no place for long walks, but he couldn't deny his grandson, whose eyes were burning with hope. "All right, but not far. And only until lunch. Bundle up." They went out into the yard, where the snow crunched under their boots. The path, familiar to both of them, led to the old oak, but winter had transformed the forest. The pines stood in white caps, and the air was so pure it seemed you could drink it. Mike ran ahead, leaving a trail of footprints behind him. "Spark, where are you?" he called, his voice echoing among the trees. The old man followed, smiling, but anxiety grew in his chest. The forest in winter was not only beautiful but also treacherous. They reached the oak where Mike stopped out of breath. "Grandpa, look. Tracks!" he exclaimed, pointing to the snow. George bent down. His heart skipped a beat. The tracks were larger than they had been in the fall, but with the same telltale imprint of a limping paw. "It's him, isn't it?" the boy whispered. The old man didn't answer, he just nodded, feeling the hope that had been smoldering inside him flare up brightly. "Let's go home, Mike. Let's not disturb him," he said, but his voice trembled. Back at the house, they sat by the stove, warming their hands on mugs of tea. Mike drew in his sketchbook. Now the wolf was running through the snow, with the moon shining above him. "He didn't forget us, Grandpa," the boy said, looking at the drawing. George nodded, but his thoughts were on the forest, the tracks, and the golden eyes that had once looked at him with trust. He didn't know what this winter would bring, but he felt something approaching, like a distant light in the night. That night, after Mike was asleep, he went out onto the porch. The moon hung over the forest, lighting the snow with silver. He stood, listening to the silence, and suddenly he heard it. A distant, drawn-out howl full of strength and freedom. The doctor's heart beat faster. "Spark," he whispered, and tears glistened in his eyes. He didn't know if the wolf would return, but the sound like a song filled his soul with warmth. The goodness he had given lived somewhere out there in the woods, and maybe it was waiting for its time. The wind howled in the chimney, but the house on the edge of the woods was warm. The fire in the stove burned steadily, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air with comfort. George sat at the table, mending an old clock whose hands had long been still. His fingers, though trembling with age, moved with a practiced precision. But the old man's thoughts weren't there. They wandered in the forest, where that distant howl he had heard that night still echoed. This sound, full of life, had taken root in his heart like a promise that had yet to reveal its meaning. Mike, visiting his grandpa for winter break, slept in the narrow bed, covered by a woolen blanket. His sketchbook lay on the table, open to the page where the wolf with golden eyes looked at the moon. George looked at the drawing and smiled. The boy never stopped believing that their wolf pup was nearby. This faith, as pure as the first snow, warmed the old man but also worried him. He knew how fragile a child's hopes could be. The next morning was clear, with a frost that bit at their cheeks. Mike woke up and exclaimed, "Grandpa, let's go to the woods. I want to find the tracks." His enthusiasm was contagious, and the old man, though he grumbled for show, agreed. "Just not far, and put on your hat," he said, pulling on his boots. They went out into the yard, where the sun dazzled their eyes, reflecting off the snow. The path to the oak was barely visible under the drifts, but Mike ran ahead, leaving clouds of steam behind him. The forest greeted them with a silence broken only by the crunch of snow. The boy searched for tracks, looking under every pine, but the snow was as clean as a sheet of paper. "Maybe he's hiding?" he asked, looking at his grandpa. George shrugged, hiding his own anxiety. "Maybe. Wolves are clever." But deep down he felt that the forest was holding a secret, and this feeling, like a thin thread, pulled him forward. They reached the old oak, where Mike suddenly stopped. "Grandpa, look," he whispered, pointing to the snow. By the tree's roots there were tracks, larger, with the distinct imprint of a limping paw. The old man's heart skipped a beat. He knelt down, touching the snow as if it could tell him the truth. "It's him," Mike said softly, his voice trembling with excitement. George nodded, but joy and fear mingled in his chest. The wolf was alive, but what had brought him so close? They returned home, but Mike couldn't sit still. He drew new pictures, chattering about how he would find the wolf and build him a little house in the yard. The old man listened, smiling, but his thoughts were restless. That night, after the boy fell asleep, he went out onto the porch again. The moon hung over the forest, lighting the snow with silver. He listened to the silence, but the howl didn't come again. "Where are you, Spark?" he whispered, and the wind seemed to touch his face in response. The next day, something happened that changed everything. Mike, full of energy as always, begged his grandpa to let him go to the woods alone. "Just to the oak and back. I know the way," he insisted, jumping with impatience. George hesitated. The winter was harsh, and the woods were no place for games. But the boy looked at him with such pleading eyes that the old man couldn't say no. "Just to the oak and be home by lunch," he said sternly, watching his grandson go. The clock ticked, but Mike didn't return. Lunchtime passed, and the path remained empty. George went out into the yard, staring into the forest. A cold anxiety like snow gripped his heart. He put on his coat, grabbed his walking stick, and went down the path, calling the boy's name. "Mike, where are you?" His voice echoed among the trees, but there was no answer. The forest, so familiar, suddenly felt alien, full of shadows and threats. He reached the oak, but it was empty. Mike's tracks led deeper into the woods, where the path disappeared in the snowdrifts. The old man walked on, ignoring the pain in his legs. His breathing was labored, but he didn't stop. "Mike," he called, his voice shaking. Fear, a feeling he hadn't known since the war, held him in its grip. He imagined the boy lost, frozen, and the thought was unbearable. The sun was setting when his strength began to fade. He stopped, leaning on his stick, and closed his eyes, whispering an old prayer his mother had taught him. And then a rustle. George turned and froze. From behind a pine tree, a wolf emerged. Not a pup, but a young animal with fur that shimmered silver in the twilight. His golden eyes met the old man's, and in them was not a threat, but something familiar. A limping paw left an uneven track in the snow. "Spark!" the doctor breathed, feeling his heart pound in his throat. The wolf looked at him, then turned and took a step toward the forest, glancing back as if inviting him to follow. George followed without a second thought. His legs trembled, but the hope that had flared in his chest was stronger than his fear. The forest closed around them, but the wolf led him confidently through the thickets and snowdrifts, where human paths had long since vanished. Twilight deepened over Pine Creek, and the forest, covered in snow, seemed like an endless labyrinth of shadows. George, gripping his walking stick, followed the wolf, whose limping paw left uneven tracks in the snow. His heart pounded, but not from exhaustion. The hope that had ignited at the sight of those familiar golden eyes led him forward. Spark, no longer the weak pup but a young animal, moved confidently, looking back as if to make sure the old man was keeping up. The forest was silent, but in that silence there was something alive, like the breath of the earth itself. They walked through thickets where branches snagged the doctor's coat, and through snowdrifts that crunched underfoot. George didn't know where the wolf was leading him, but he trusted him as he would an old friend. Memories of him nursing the little one by the stove, of the pup licking his hand, flashed in his mind, giving him strength. "Just to find him," the old man whispered, thinking of his grandson, whose absence was tearing his heart apart. Suddenly, the wolf stopped at the foot of a moss-covered cliff. In its shadow, under an overhanging ledge, Mike lay curled in a ball. His face was pale, but his chest was rising. He was breathing. "Mike!" George exhaled, rushing to the boy. He knelt down, ignoring the pain in his joints, and hugged his grandson tight. "Little one, I'm here." Mike stirred, opening his eyes, which were cloudy with fear and cold. "Grandpa, I got lost," he whispered, shivering. The old man took off his coat and wrapped it around the boy, rubbing his frozen hands. He looked at the wolf standing to the side. Spark watched them, his eyes twinkling in the semi-darkness like stars. "You brought me to him," the doctor said softly, and his voice held a gratitude as deep as the forest. The wolf tilted his head, as if understanding, and retreated into the shadows. The journey back was difficult. George carried Mike in his arms, though his strength was waning. The boy clung to him, whispering, "I saw Spark. He found me." The old man didn't reply. He focused on each step, on getting his grandson home. The forest, as if sensing their plight, gave way, and the moon lit the path with silver. When they finally saw the lights of the house, the doctor felt tears stinging his eyes. They were home. They were alive. Inside, he lit the fire, wrapped Mike in a blanket, and gave him hot tea. The boy, warming up, began to talk, his voice trembling from the ordeal. "I followed the tracks, Grandpa. I wanted to find Spark." And then everything got mixed up and I didn't know where I was. I screamed but no one heard. And then he came. He licked my hand just like before, and I knew he wanted to help. George listened, stroking his grandson's head. He didn't forget us, Mike, he said, and there was a quiet joy in his words. That night, after the boy was asleep, the old man went out onto the porch. Snow was falling in soft flakes, covering the tracks of their journey. He looked at the forest, where somewhere among the pines lived the wolf who had brought him his grandson back. "Thank you, Spark," he whispered, and the wind carried his words into the night. Deep down he knew they would never see each other again, but it didn't matter. The goodness he had given had returned tenfold, and the thought warmed him like the fire in the stove. 6 months passed. Spring came to Pine Creek, awakening the forest with babbling brooks and the singing of birds. Mike, visiting his grandpa, still drew the wolf, but now he wasn't alone in his pictures. Stars shone beside him as symbols of hope. George kept these drawings in an old chest next to his wife's letters. He often thought about how one night, one action had changed everything. He had saved a wolf pup, and that pup had saved his grandson, and maybe even himself by restoring his faith in miracles. One day, walking with Mike by the old oak, they heard a distant howl, long and full of strength. The boy froze, his eyes lighting up. "It's him, Grandpa, isn't it?" The old man nodded, smiling. "It's him, Mike. He's saying everything is all right." They stood, listening to the forest sing its song, and in that moment they both felt it. Their story with the wolf wasn't over. It lived within them, in their love and their belief that goodness always comes back.